Directed by Dinga Bakaba and Sébastien Mitton, developed by Arkane Lyon, and published by Bethesda Softworks, Deathloop is a 2021 immersive sim about rival assassins stuck in a time loop against a 60s Bond backdrop. The pitch is very strong, so as both an Arkane fan and a Bond fan, I had to play it for myself. The game isn't very widely discussed, especially in comparison to some of Arkane's previous work like The Dishonored's and Prey 2017. I think that is in no small part due to how experimental it is. As fascinating as the game is, it's also a bit of a mixed bag. Deathloop has no difficulty presets, so I played it without changing any of its many difficulty settings. The playthrough took about 16.5 hours, which is around the average time according to how long to beat. With a Metacritic score of 88 and a user score of 6.7, it's fair to say that the game's reception was mixed, an impression reinforced by the fact that only 25% of Steam players have the achievement for completing the game. Much as I enjoy the game, I too feel a bit mixed about it, partly because of the game-breaking bug I encountered twice, but mostly because of the repetitive nature of the game. The longer the game goes on, the less fun it gets, and I'm not surprised that so many people drop it before the credits roll. The setup for the game is that our protagonist Colt is stuck. Where is he stuck? On the North Atlantic-esque island of Black Reef. When is he stuck? Sometime in a 1960s age, on a day which endlessly repeats. Colt wants to break the time loop and figures out that to do so he needs to kill all the visionaries, the group of people who set up the loop, before it repeats. Sounds simple enough, especially since most people don't retain their memories from one loop to the next. The only exceptions are Colt and Juliana, a rival assassin, and she's quite the problem as she wants to preserve the loop. The island has 4 locations and 4 time slots, and depending on when you are where, the locations can change quite a bit. While the moment-to-moment gameplay is that of a classic Arkane immersive sim, the fact that the time and place matters essentially makes the overarching game a puzzle game, or, to put it another way, on the tactical level, it is an MSIM, and on a strategic level, it's a puzzle game. That's a fascinating way to construct a game, and when you add some of its other unusual mechanics like the asymmetric multiplayer, it becomes clear just how avant-garde Deathloop is in a way that is difficult to tell just by looking at it. The central idea is that of rival assassins fighting in a time loop which requires Juliana to be active in the game world for optimal effect. The rivalry would be undermined if Juliana was not a difficult challenge, and it's hard to motivate cutscene-only fights or scripted losses for the player when the central premise of the story means that death is at worst a minor inconvenience. So Arkane ends up with the impossible task of making an AI opponent smart enough and unpredictable enough to be a serious and believable rival for the player, while also making sure it isn't too powerful. Sounds impossible. So, Arkane decided to let players fill the role of Juliana instead, as they are best suited to be smart and unpredictable. It's a wonderful idea, and when you're matched against a real player who doesn't give up after 3 minutes, it's super cool. The game locks you in the level until you hack an antenna at a fixed location to make sure Colt can't just escape as soon as you get the notification that Juliana's on the hunt. And Juliana only attacks you when you're in a level where there is a visionary, so that she doesn't hunt you when you're doing low stakes investigation or farming. Juliana also drops good loot, including the superpowers known on Black Reef as slabs, which only the visionaries have, which means that the rewards for taking her down is worth the effort. Speaking of slabs, Colt's slab lets him die 2 times before dying for real, and Juliana's lets her disguise herself as another character, which makes sure that both sides have unique mechanics while also making sure that the odds are slightly in Colt's favor. That's important, as the game can't know how important the loop or level Colt is currently doing is. If he's about to break the loop with his route figured out, being taken down by Juliana is a lot more frustrating than if he is taking down a visionary to get their slab for the first time. The multiplayer aspect is only relevant to the tactical level of the game, and that really is where the game is at its best. The Void engine is, in my view, uniquely suited to first-person shooting, as it has some great peeking mechanics, which makes it fun to shoot from cover in a first-person shooter, in a way that I've never seen from another game. It also handles the powers without issue, and as expected from Arkane, the level design is both fun in its own right, and stuffed full of ImSim tools like batteries, turrets, bottles, and fireworks. Deathloop also marks the triumphant return of the kick which I so dearly loved in Dark Messiah, and while it is a fair bit weaker here, and the fact that you'll primarily engage enemies with the ranged weapons means that it doesn't find as many use cases, it's still great fun. The guns of Deathloop are also good, but there are, in my opinion, way too few for the length of the game. They feel good to shoot and have unique designs, and while they seem to have just random spray patterns, they occasionally jam a la Far Cry 2, which introduces that ImSim chaos into your battles. The problem is that there are a total of 13 guns, 5 of which are uniques, which requires completing a quest or challenge, or just a lot of exploring to find, meaning that most players will only see the 8 standard guns for most of their time with the game. Guns have rarities, traits, and upgrades, which should, in theory, increase variety, but in practice decreases variety even further for me. I found this silenced machine pistol quite early in the game, and to say that it became a dominant strategy is quite the understatement. This Limp 10 is better than all of the other guns in the game I tried without any upgrade if you have any interest in stealth, and when you throw some upgrades on it and combine it with the Nexus slab, it becomes so good that nothing else can compete. In Far Cry 2, I might switch from a theoretical OP gun if it jammed during an intense firefight, but in Deathloop, only the grey basic version of guns jam. The counter to the Wonder Gun crutch in a time loop scenario would obviously be that the player has to go and get it every loop, but Deathloop has a currency called Residuum, which you can spend to infuse your equipment so that it persists between loops. Residuum, however, is not rare, and you can sell unwanted inventory to get more of it, which means that you'll easily afford to keep your favorite guns. Initially, I thought that dying with an infused gun would mean losing it, but no, if it's infused, it's yours forever, no matter what. That system works well for the slabs, as it would be a pain to lose the teleport slab or nexus, but giving the player a permanent OP gun with permanent upgrades which never jams is being too generous. A stealth-focused player can, if they know where to look, get everything they need, i.e. the silenced Limb 10, Nexus, and Shift within one loop with one time slot to spare. After that, the gearing up process is adding nice-to-haves, not essentials or tools which are likely to change your playstyle. These issues at the tactical level, stemming from the game being too lenient with the player, are exacerbated by the issues the game has at the strategic level. As with any puzzle game, you have to start by gathering all the information before you can figure out the correct sequence. The game gives you hints and keeps track of relevant times, places, and events in your journal, which acts as a sort of quest tracker. You have to go through each quest to figure out how to make each visionary vulnerable, and to know when you need to be there to get them. The game randomizes some codes you'll need, so even on a replay, you will have to go through certain mandatory steps in order to complete the Deathloop, i.e. the loop where you kill all the visionaries even if you know the correct sequence from a previous playthrough. This means that you have to go to many different locations at many different times to get all the clues and codes necessary to perform the Deathloop. And since time only moves in one direction, it can be quite the faff to find clues when you need to go to 2 different locations at the same time. Again, this would be a lot less grating if there were good items and gear to find there, but by the time your investigation is in full swing, you have likely already infused one or a couple of guns you like, and since there are only 8 basic guns, you will already know which ones you like and which ones you don't. Most of the time, by the mid-game, you are only in a specific location at a specific time to find a clue, which you may or may not need to use at another location at an earlier time to get the next clue. This means that the game becomes a very complicated yak shaving exercise where I'm at the complex in the morning so that I can redirect power to the military bunker in Carl's Bay, which I need to get a password I'll use in UpDom after I've killed a certain visionary, and so on. As mentioned, time moves in one way only, so if you finished up at one location in the morning and you need to be at another location in the morning, you have to wait the whole day to start a new loop instead of using a map selection UI, which adds to the faff. The aforementioned password is one of 3 passwords needed, the acquisition of which takes you to literally all the maps in a sequence which feels a lot like padding. And Deathloop really didn't need any padding. The game's maps are fun and distinct, but they start to get significantly less interesting the 4th or 5th time you're on them, even if they do change between time slots. I think if the game was 10 hours long, it would have been a lot more popular than it is, as all the repetition with no real rewards for your character starts to become tedious. The game's capstone feature, the time loop itself, is mostly a hassle by the mid-game and has no discernible impact on the game at all in the late game. Adding quality of life features like keeping equipment between loops is a good idea, but not when it goes so far as to make the time loop in the time loop game mechanically irrelevant. The story in Deathloop feels quite reminiscent of The Dishonored's. An assassin has to hunt down a variety of eccentric elites, each one with their own strange sensibilities and often cruel demeanors. What makes the story interesting is the time loop aspect and the way the game borrows from Sean Connery era Bond movies. Arkane clearly toyed with the 60s Bond architecture back in Dishonored 2's Karnaka, but in Deathloop they go all out. There are both the extravagant villain lairs and the military and scientific structures in industrial concrete. To say that the art direction is great is to state the obvious, but the story doesn't fill out the world of high society, high tech, and high treason that the visuals hint at. The game's story is hampered by the way it constructs its time loop. Colt and Juliana are the only people on Blackreef who get to keep their memories from one loop to another, and thus they are the only people with any agency. This means that, while there are other characters in the Visionaries, they are more like the bosses of Dark Souls than the villains of Mass Effect. Sure, they have a presence in the world, and there is a lot of lore giving an impression of who they are and what they've done, but they are no longer active forces in the world which shape events, instead acting primarily as mechanical obstacles for the player. The island of Blackreef is layered with military structures on top of which the Visionaries built their Aeon project, and Colt is visited by other cults from other timelines, and he gets messages from someone or something through the text in his head, implying a deeper history with secrets to uncover. Before we start discussing such secrets though, here's where I'll warn you about spoilers. I won't spoil everything, but I will spoil some of the things, so if you are interested in Deathloop, I think you should play it instead of getting it spoiled here. From the Bond stylings of the world and the weird floating text, I thought there were layers to the story, and that there were answers to be found. Perhaps I was paranoid after playing Bioshock recently, but I thought for sure that there was a deep reason that Colt wanted to break the loop. Is he a Manchurian candidate sent to Blackreef to steal the Visionary's secrets to controlling time? Or is Juliana a double agent who only pretends to want to preserve the loop, to trick Colt into helping her break it? No and no. The game hints at and takes inspiration from spy media, but it's not interested in telling a story about betrayal, intrigue, and espionage. It's interested in telling a story about two people in a time loop. Breaking the loop doesn't give many answers, and unlike some other time loop stories, the loop is not a vehicle for character growth. It is very clear that the story is of secondary concern to the gameplay opportunities the loop provides, and as such, the story doesn't really do anything interesting with it. Where did the other cults come from, and how did they end up here? Who knows? And more importantly, who cares? Arkane seems to ask. Why can only Colt and Juliana remember what happened last loop? The gameplay reason is obvious, so a story reason is superfluous. Colt and Juliana are both well acted, and it's hard not to be charmed by Jason Kelly and Ozioma Akaga's performances. Even when the characters' motivations are paper thin, their characterizations are strong, and so is their banter. Time loops are a great entry point to a lot of potentially interesting philosophical issues. Can you find meaning in the Sisyphean existence completely devoid of lasting consequences that a time loop represents? Does evil exist when any cruel actions are devoid of lasting consequences? Is Colt and Juliana's eternal youth a blessing or a curse? The game isn't interested in these questions. A spy duel in a time loop where only the spies keep their memories is also a perfect setting for complex mind games, but the game isn't interested in that either. Ultimately, the only thing the game really is interested in is its sim gameplay, to the point that it undermines several of its own mechanics related to the time loop. Deathloop is a fascinating game to discuss because of how clever and creative it is, but precisely because of that, the game can be disappointing to play, as the clever systems and creative design never truly coheres into a sum greater, or even equal, to its parts. If the game was shorter, it would be an easier game to recommend, and perhaps it was too experimental to warrant such a long duration. Sims require an objective to work. One of the reasons why Deathloop and the Switch-era Zeldas are lesser Sims than, say, the original Deus Ex and the Dishonored is that the former often tasks the player with objectives which cannot be completed through creative use of the mechanics provided. It doesn't matter how creative your Tears of the Kingdom car is, or how imaginative your kill of a visionary is, when that car can't drive into the air temple, and when that visionary doesn't give you the password to the military bunker. Deathloop's strategic level objectives are mostly about finding information, and that information is in the form of a document or a recording, and slabs, guns, and kicks just don't work on documents. Moment-to-moment gameplay in Deathloop is incredible, with great level design and that arcane magic in the game feel, but that can't weigh up the game's flaws in terms of narrative and its confused design surrounding the time loop. I'm glad I played Deathloop, and it's heartening to see Arkane and Bethesda decided to go ahead with such an experimental project. The experiment was not a total success. It's not for everyone, but making games like this is good for the studio and for the industry as it pushes boundaries. Unlike on Black Reef, in reality, there is no guarantee that Arkane will get a new chance at the same idea, but I really hope they do. Directed by Dinga Bakaba and Sébastien Mitton,